of keeping plants alive, what about potting mix and soil? Soil, like how do we,
Yeah.
you know, can we just dig up, can I take soil out of my garden, put it in a flower pot? Is there a particular potting mix I should have? Is there an ideal, I mean, there's rules for ideal soil for a garden. And as Robert Pavlis just told me the other day, there's an ideal soil and nobody has it. But but for, I guess for the potting in a pot, sort of you are God. You're the God of that little
Yeah.
universe, that little planet. So yeah, what do you want to stick in there in terms of soil?
Well, I know we've been saying soil. I've been saying soil the whole time so far, but yeah, I don't use soil in my containers actually. You can't take garden soil of your garden and put it in a container. I mean, every time you water, it just gets compacted and compacted further down, and you've got no air spaces left in that soil. It's not light and fluffy anymore. It's not free draining. It's going to smother your plants. So unfortunately, garden soil does not work in containers. You need to get a potting mix, lightweight potting mix, and most of them are going to be made from materials like peat moss, vermiculite, perlite. There's probably going to be some fertilizers in there, but you know, that's basically what's in an all-purpose potting mix. It's expensive, but that's really all that it is. Now, the issue is peat is not all really that environmentally friendly or renewable, you know, so that's a big conversation right now in the UK, and it's certainly coming here as well. And we're going to see that happening in the next couple of years. Should we be taking peat from our peat bogs for gardening? You know, that's going to be a big conversation. Now, another option people are using for potting mixes, because you can DIY your own potting mix as well as buy them, is coconut coir. Also not really very renewable, nor is it environmentally friendly, because it travels so far to get to us, you know, here in the northern hemisphere. So, you know, we don't have a great, you know, product to sub in there. Compost, I'm actually experimenting with compost potting mixes I've been mixing up this spring to see how they do. So I'm growing things in compost mixed with vermiculite and perlite and some other materials. We'll see, but I think we're going to have a total, you know, change coming to the potting mix industry in the coming years. And yeah, it's not far away. It's almost here.
One thing I do out of cheapness, so my wife always wants a geranium on the front step once it gets warm, always. I can't get around. I can't talk her out of it. It's not the best.
That's okay.
I know. I always want something that's just, it's not the sunniest spot. So I always want something that's got colorful leaves, right? But anyway, you can't win. So, so out of cheapness, one thing I'll do with the pot is almost copy a trick I use in my garden where I bury rotten wood. And so let's say I've got a pot that's 12 inches high. I make the bottom 4 inches just, you know, rotten wood that I found in the backyard, and just take up the space, because the plant roots aren't going all the way down, or if they are, you know, I mean, there's a lot of space in that, but it's a large pot. There's a lot of space.
And some pots are very upright. Like one of the big trends is these like 3 foot tall pots. And yeah, you're right. Like I usually fill the bottom half with like old containers or something, you know, so you don't spend a fortune on potting mix. Now, the other option actually for potting mix that I'm experimenting with is also leaf mold. So composting leaves and then mixing that with other compost and vermiculite and perlite and things to see if I can create a potting mix that's going to work for my plants. So we've got some options for the future, but for now, most potting mixes you would use are going to be peat-based across Canada.
We've got the location, we've got the container, we've got the mix. Now, in terms of vegetables, what do we want to think about growing in pots? So I imagine not everything can be grown. I guess if you think about a pot can be any size. Conceivably, you could grow anything in a pot. But if we're thinking about, you know, 1 foot high, 1 foot wide, what most people can pick up and move around and manage. What are we talking about growing in pots in terms of vegetables?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen pots grown in everything, and I've seen every type of vegetable, or vegetables grown in every type of pot, and you certainly can grow anything you want. Another popular item to upcycle are those Rubbermaid containers, you know, the big, what are they, like almost 3 feet by 2 feet, putting a bunch of holes in the bottom of those. You can even DIY them into self-watering containers, which is great, with like a water reservoir in the bottom. And you can plant 4 tomato plants in there. I've seen people grow corn in that. I mean, giant
That's a great idea.
Right? So if the container's the right size, you can grow anything. You know, but that's up to you, I guess, and how much space you have. And like you said, if you want to move it around, once my containers are filled, I don't move them around. They're on the deck until the end of the season. They're in front of my greenhouse. I certainly can't move my fabric beds in the greenhouse around. They weigh about 400 pounds each at this point. So yeah, they're there until the end of the season. But so again, I would like to think people use a bigger size container. But then, you can grow so many different kinds of vegetables, whatever you like to eat. That's what I tell people, grow what you like to eat. So if you like cucumbers, grow cucumbers. But of course, thanks to plant breeders, we have so many new varieties and cultivars that have been introduced the past decade or so that are pot friendly, for growing in containers. Cucumbers that only grow, 2 feet tall that you can put in a tomato cage in a container. Tomatoes that grow, my gosh, 8 or 9 inches tall. I've got micro tom tomatoes growing. I've got red robin. These guys only get this big, but they'll still produce a couple dozen tomatoes. You can get tumbling tom tomato, which is just like a hanging basket tomato, maybe 10 or 12 inches, and that'll still produce probably 60 tomatoes over the course of the summer or more. There's peppers that are very compact, so zucchini that are bred for container growing. So
Really?
I would say read your seed catalogs carefully, read the labels when you go to the garden center carefully, and pick out varieties meant to be grown in containers or planters. Sometimes it will say like bush tomato or bush cucumber, or I'll say patio or dwarf. So read the labels, and some of those buzzwords will tell you that it's meant to be grown in a container. But again, as long as the container is big enough, go crazy. So someone on Facebook asked me a question a couple of days ago about one of the tomatoes they were growing in their garden, and they sent pictures, and they were this little mounds of tomatoes. And they were just kind of like, she goes, I don't know why they're growing downwards. It's this tomato, I want it to get pretty big. But it was a tumbling tom tomato. So that's how it grows. It's a dwarf cascading tomato variety. So I would say just make sure when you're reading labels, you pick the right tomato and either grow it in a garden bed or a container, depending on what type of tomato it is.
Yeah, you don't want to, what's that called? Undeterminate, or what's that?
Yeah,
term?
Indeterminate or determinate.
Yeah, you don't want
so determinate
indeterminate.
tomatoes. Yeah, determinate go about maybe 4 feet tall, some are 3 feet tall, and then they'll produce their fruits pretty much all over like a similar time frame, so you can harvest, which is great for canning or making sauces. But indeterminate tomatoes or vining tomatoes, whoop, they go tall, 7 feet tall or bigger sometimes, and they'll produce so over a longer period of time. So I mean, I grow both, but if you're growing in a container, probably determinate are the ones you want to grow.
Well, speaking of which, if I am growing something that's gonna grow high or grow, a vine or whatever, what are my options for, trellising and supporting climbing plants when I'm growing in pots?
Yeah, because I mean, so many types of vegetables climb, and there's a lot of benefits for growing vining vegetables. You can fit more food in less space by growing them up instead of out over a garden bed or containers. They'll have fewer insect disease problems when grown vertically. There's better air circulation, and for many things, it's easier to pick. When things are grown up, cucumbers, melons, things like that. So there's a lot of benefits to growing things vertically. So I plant in containers at the base of trellises, at the base of some of my bean tunnels. If you have a fence, you can use. You can also use bamboo posts or something to create like a little structure, like inside the container. You can buy container trellises and structures. You can use tomato cages to grow things vertically in containers. You can use just a single stake if you're growing just one tall type of tomato, and then tie it as it grows up, sort of thing. So there's many options for growing vertically. You can buy bean and pea netting, things like that too. So yeah, you can DIY with strings. I mean, in my greenhouse, the whole center is basically twine, and all the tomatoes and cucumbers and melons are grown vertically on twine.
You mean that it's hanging from the ceiling?
Yeah, because the greenhouse,
cool.
it's 14 feet wide, so it's got trusses at the top, steel trusses, and I have wires run down the trusses. So I just tie the strings to that, and they just grow vertically on those.
That's really cool. I guess also if you're on a deck and it had like a railing, you could, strategically position things so the railing becomes like a trellis.
Or if you had a pergola, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, get your beans growing up there. Get something amazing looking.